With the end of the Cold War, things were set to change. As old tensions lessened, policies and sanctions put in place at the peak of the Red Scare were no longer viewed as essential, leading many of them to be dismantled. Among the things removed, though only after protests by human rights groups and doctors, was mandatory sex testing by both the International Olympic Committee and World Athletics. This meant that, for some, specifically white women, things seemed to be on the up. The same could not be said for women of colour. For whilst mandatory sex testing was no more, ad hoc tests could and would be weaponised against darker-skinned women, punishing them for doing well. That's why we need to talk about the ways in which racism and colonialism, including colonial experimentation, paved the way for transphobia in modern-day sports. Though, before we do, I just need to give a quick content warning for the following: transphobia, intermisia, racism, sexism, misogyny, medical violence, colonialism, white supremacy, and attempted suicide. If you like our work and appreciate the research put into each video, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. As noted in the previous two videos, this is the third and final piece in a three-part series covering the expansive history of transphobia in sports, as well as how it intersects with intermisia, homomisia, misogyny, and racism. The first video looked into the creation of the modern Olympics, how women were initially excluded and how they fought to compete alongside their male peers. We looked at the way in which any time a woman challenged men on their own terms, sporting leagues would exclude them in order to artificially preserve the belief that women have some sort of inherent biological disadvantage when it comes to all forms of athleticism. We also covered the emergence of trans men and intersex athletes and how they came to be seen as a challenge to the status quo in the period leading up to and during the Second World War, causing some to question whether sports was having a masculinizing effect upon women. The second video looked into how the Red Scare led to the emergence of the cult of testosterone and the increased policing of women's bodies in sport, resulting in the introduction of mandatory sex testing that harmed all women. We also looked at how narratives surrounding the topic impacted popular culture, leading many to view testosterone as the master molecule of athleticism, some supposed superdrug that meant women could never hope to compete on the same level as men, in spite of said claim lacking sound empirical merit. That is to say that there has, to date, never been a study that compares the impact of both testosterone and estrogen on athletic performance that also accounts for the extraneous variables of societal sexism, seen in the stereotyping of children, sponsorship disparities, medical disparities, and the way female athletes have been punished throughout sports history for performing well. And whilst one would hope that things would improve with the end of the Cold War in 1991, the removal of mandatory sex testing by the millennium, and the allowance of trans women to compete by the time of the 2004 Athens Olympics, that sadly wasn't the case for the vast majority of female athletes. You see, the master molecule myth discussed in the previous video had been established as the dominant belief in society. People not only viewed the hormone as an athletic superdrug, believing it to be the single most important factor in male sports, but they were convinced that they could tell who was and was not intersex or trans as a result, pointing to certain signs, tells as they're sometimes called. This general idea had existed during the Cold War, seen in how East European women were stereotyped as large, muscular, and thereby suspiciously masculine. However, as mentioned briefly in the previous video, they weren't alone. Another group stereotyped in this manner were women of colour, particularly dark-skinned black women. Mass movements, such as the post-war Jamaican diaspora, increased the visibility of non-white women present in the global north, something that came to be viewed as a challenge to Western notions of femininity. In the UK, suspicions grew to the point that, by 1948, groups such as the British Women's Amateur Athletic Association began demanding that female participants provide medical certification that declared them to be women. This suspicion of non-white women would continue to be present throughout the Cold War, albeit to a lesser degree, with the focus primarily being on East European women as the enemy. That said, as tensions between East and West began to settle, women of colour found themselves catapulted into the spotlight as the group to publicly scrutinise, an idea not helped by a long and sordid history of white supremacy. Misogyny, the specific blend of misogyny and anti-black racism felt predominantly by black women, had long stereotyped black women as loud, unattractive, and masculine as a means of devaluing and dehumanizing them. Black women have historically been stripped of their softness and, in doing so, their very femininity. This meant that, as they became the primary target in sports, it was easy for white supremacists to call back on said pre-existing racist structure, allowing bigoted spectators to point towards any number of arbitrary features to engage in racist, sexist, intermisic, and transmisic abuse. Big hands, being tall, and having broad shoulders were some of their favourite tells. These tells became so popular, in fact, that they would even go on to be applied outside of sports as said abuse became normalised, resulting in the whole transvestigation conspiracy theory in which randos online scrutinise celebrities, particularly black women, to assert that they're secretly transgender. One high-profile case is that of Michelle Obama, who was often accused of being a trans woman. This was a mentality not helped by the portrayal of trans people in both film and television, particularly in comedy. Writers would often fall back on such tells to signal to the audience that a specific character was trans or intersex, information the protagonist would miss to begin with, only to then display their disgust or sense of betrayal upon finding out. This was done to elicit laughter from the audience in being the ones in on the joke, which would, over time, evolve into the trap trope, a situation in which nobody wants to be the one caught out. This narrative primed people to be in this mindset, telling them that it was normal and even necessary to go around judging others based on their appearance or their performance. When society equates masculinity with athletic prowess, as with the master molecule myth, and masculinity, every woman at the top of their league becomes suspiciously masculine. This, on its own, is usually not enough to provoke accusations of secretly being a man, i.e. trans or intersex. But couple it with white supremacy and Western patriarchal standards of femininity, and we have the perfect bigoted storm in which women of colour become the targets of such accusations anytime they succeed, which is violence that the very existence of ad hoc sex tests legitimizes. In many ways, the new system is even worse than the old one, at least to those targeted. When the IOC classed 8 women at the 1996 Atlanta Olympics as men under mandatory testing, they reviewed all the cases in private before going on to rule that they were all, in fact, women. Yet, under the system of ad hoc testing, any time an athlete is challenged, this is done publicly. There is something especially cruel about singling out a specific woman of colour in her moment of triumph, drawing into question her very sexual identity. It takes violence that all women were previously made to suffer and turns it into a public spectacle, a form of cruel and unusual punishment that the general public is invited to engage in. At the same time, it warns women of colour that their participation is only permitted so long as they never challenge the perceived default of white women's supremacy. A fact made all the worse when we stop to consider the ways in which the IOC and WA love to parade women of colour out as inspiration porn, tokens for them to cash in as proof that they're leading some sort of humanitarian effort. That's how women of colour are treated in sports, and we'll cover a few case studies later in the video. So that tells us the who and how, but what about the why? Why are people hunting for secret trans and intersex athletes in women's sports to begin with? Why are people so bothered by this? Well, it all goes back to the master molecule myth. With intersex women, it's generally assumed that they have hyperandrogenism, where the body naturally produces more testosterone than is typically seen in endosex cis women, leading to the belief that said intersex cis women has some sort of athletic edge. With trans women, it's the belief that, having gone through natal puberty, they become athletic super soldiers who need to be handicapped to give real women a chance. Though, even then, many bigots would rather they're outright removed, same for intersex women. Thing is, you can kind of understand why they believe this. After all, this is a narrative pushed by the likes of Dr. Stefan Berman, a sports physician who works for the WA and has even gone on to become the director of their health and science department. During a 2014 hearing, Dr. Berman rather humbly called himself, quote, the go-to person for all matters relating to and arising under the hyperandrogenism regulations, end quote, stating very publicly that he was, quote-unquote, actively involved in every single hyperandrogenism case the WA had dealt with following the introduction of its 2011 regulations regarding said trait. He also stated that, without strict regulation, sporting events, in particular middle distance finals, quote, would likely become dominated by female athletes with hyperandrogenism and athletes who are doping, end quote. Here, we see another common trick used by the believers of the master molecule myth, the conflation of natural levels of testosterone in the human body to artificially increasing those levels via doping. Doping works because of additional sex hormones, which in this case just so happens to be testosterone due to the sexist assumptions laid down during the Red Scare, increase select traits associated with athleticism, e.g. bone mineral density and muscle mass. It's not about replacing estrogen with testosterone as with hyperandrogenism and trans people on HRT, it's about artificially stacking additional sex hormones on top of what already naturally exists. This, by the way, is where many of the health problems associated with doping come into effect. High levels of any sex hormone can be harmful to your health, meaning that as you continue doping yourself, your body detects said increase and begins shutting down its own hormone production to try and bring your levels back down to a safe baseline. It should be noted that this change is often irreversible, meaning many people who have been doping for long enough often have to continue doing so since their body no longer makes the hormone naturally. That's why athletes who dope often have to increase the amount they're on just to see any gain, since the initial doping is now replacing what the body used to produce on its own. These are health problems intersex people with hyperandrogenism and trans women do not typically suffer because they are completely different scenarios, biologically speaking. Imagine I had a wooden ladder. Now, I want to make my ladder taller, so I stick a couple extra rungs on the end. That is akin to doping, with each extended rung being analogous to additional sex hormones. With intersex people or trans people on HRT, it is like cutting out existing rungs from my ladder, a few as with intersex people and all for trans people on HRT, only to replace those rungs with a different kind of wood. In the second instance, the ladder hasn't become any longer, it still performs identically as a ladder, it just has rungs that are different. Dr. Berman is deliberately conflating people's natural or baseline hormone levels, those which their bodies stabilize at or were reached with the support of an endocrine specialist, with artificially inflating them. Whilst you might think this is a harmless belief, I must note that this is the foundational belief upon which Dr. Berman and the WA argue that gonadectomies, surgically removing one's gonads, are a proportionate demand placed on intersex and trans athletes. Dr. Berman believes so strongly in this, in fact, that he has publicly gone after people for criticizing said position. When the World Medical Association called upon sporting associations to boycott the WA over its discriminatory policies regarding intersex athletes in 2018, Dr. Berman said the following regarding the gonadectomies specifically. Quote, "This treatment has been demonized by bioethics brokers who cogitate in their beautiful Stanford offices in the States, but who have never brought their US-centric vision to bear on the very real situations of these African DSD athletes that I have encountered over the past 12 years. End quote. DSD, as Dr. Berman is using it, stands for Disorders of Sexual Development, what intersex communities have self-labelled differences in sexual development. When I use DSD, I'm using the latter. When Dr. Berman uses it, he is using the former. We'll come back to the part regarding intersex women from Africa in the case studies, but for now I turn to the work of Helen Lenski, who, in her 2020 book, rightfully pointed out that it was Dr. Berman and World Athletics who, quote, might be justly accused of imposing their Eurocentric vision of normal femininity on African and Indian athletes, end quote, going on to add that, quote, the so-called bioethics brokers in question were probably Stanford cultural anthropologist Katrina Karkazes and social medical scientist Rebecca Jordan-Young, whose 2018 article in Feminist Formations included a scathing critique of Berman's presentation to the 2012 International Conventions on Science, Education and Medicine and Sport. Karkazes and Jordan-Young reported that Berman had recommended mandatory gynecological examinations for all female athletes before competition. He had lamented the fact that genital exams were not very popular in poor countries, noting that detection of perceived abnormalities could lead to early diagnosis and treatment. End quote. By the way, I tracked down that paper since I wanted to see the full quote in its full context, and yeah, it's even worse than Helen lit on. Dr. Berman stated the following at the 2012 International Conventions on Science, Education and Medicine in Sport conference. Quote, as I told you before, a lot of these cases arise in poor countries or developing countries where diagnosis is not done at birth, like is the case in Western countries at least. Diagnosis is not done, and you realize that you have a 16 or 18 years old, very well performing athlete with an intersex condition who's going to enter into major championship and here probably would be stopped. End quote. Leading Katrina and Rebecca to rightfully point out that, with his use of here in the last sentence, Berman anchored himself and his listeners to the rich and developed countries of the global north. This is something he'd continue to poke at, giving us the following quote. First, hyperandrogenism, especially DSD, is not so rare in female sports, at least athletics. I say at least athletics because, as you probably know, athletics is a whole world sport. It's not purely the Caucasian sports. We have a lot of people coming from Africa, Asia, and we have a lot of these cases coming from these countries. So of course, there is a kind of recruitment bias, a double one. One, because they have an unfair advantage, some of them, so of course they compete better and they reach more easily the higher level. And the other one is, I would say, an ethnic or local area recruitment bias, because they are undiagnosed at birth, so they are raised with this condition, and they arrive at the highest level with this condition, which is quite seldom in rich countries where they are treated just after birth. End quote. So he very openly wants to impose these standards of the global north upon the global south, yet when criticized for that, spins around and accuses his critics of not thinking about those poor developing people who need his guidance as a white French physician. There's also straight up eugenics here, in how intersex people, a group that makes up 2% of all live births globally, are presented as a disease that needs to be treated, specifically via invasive surgery, such as gonadectomies. Now, Dr. Berman and the WA claim that this is for their own health, citing the facts that doping causes health issues as proof that the same must be true for people with hyperandrogenism, ignoring the fact that the body has means of reducing the sex hormones it produces to safe levels. It also completely contradicts Dr. Berman's own argument, since if differences in sexual development were so harmful, everyone with said trait would be recorded due to those problems making said differences known. Of course, they aren't, because the majority of DSDs are entirely neutral. That's one of the reasons DSDs are so heavily undercounted, because most intersex people go through their entire life without realizing that they're intersex. So, Dr. Berman's arguments regarding the secret intersex are incompatible with his claims that said people need to be treated for their own health, demonstrating how this is little more than an ad hoc justification. Yet, as if that wasn't bad enough, returning to the interview in which Dr. Berman attacked his critics, he also went on to target his interviewer with the following tirade. Quote, Roger Pugh, our science watchdog. Of course, we do not treat our athletes like guinea pigs, but if we affirm this on the social networks, he scores. He forgets one small detail. This estrogen pill treatment is the standard of care for transgender 46XY who want to assert their feminine gender, or sex. I do not believe that these thousands of transgender MTS are considered guinea pigs by the scientific community. I hate to be disappointing, but for me, the approach is quite simple. You want to compete in the protected feminine category? Then you must not oppose a treatment that affirms your feminine gender and lowers your T levels to female norms, and all the more if you shout from the rooftops that you are a woman. You have every right to refuse, and in that case, you have alternatives, competing with men, the intersex categories, national competitions, or in track and field events outside of the 400 metre to a mile, just over 1,600 metres. But in the end, maybe you don't want to do it because you won't have the money and glory. To be able to participate in a competition is a right. The right to win is not. End quote. Emphasis by Dr. Berman. Keeping in mind, this guy is the director of the Health and Science Department at World Athletics, we can begin to see how we end up with a bunch of scientifically illiterate jocks spouting absolute horseshit whenever possible. This is the standard set by an apparent reputable sporting league. As for trans people, there's a difference between me as a trans person opting to pursue medical transition of my own accord and an intersex athlete being told that they won't be allowed to compete unless they submit to the same procedure. That difference is a little something called informed consent, something that cannot be given under duress or coercion, such as holding a person's entire career at ransom. Though, trust me, the fact that Dr. Berman doesn't seem to understand nor care about informed consent will be incredibly relevant when we discuss the cases of Annet Negesa and Lara. Though this argument also touches on why I'm talking about intersex people so much in a video about transmisia in sport, as well as why this discussion became so toxic around 2017 to 2018. A 2020 report by Human Rights Watch revealed that there were deliberate attempts by both World Athletics and various media outlets during this period to conflate intersex people with trans people, tapping into and supercharging the wider anti-trans hysteria coming off of the bathroom panic from 2014 to 2016 as a means to justify violence against both trans women and intersex cis women. And we really can't ignore the timing of all this when we consider just how toxic the discussion was made. As noted in the previous video, whilst the IOC was criticised for allowing trans women to compete as of the 2004 Athens Olympics, said criticism is absolutely dwarfed by the recent backlash. This, in my mind, is the result of two bioessentialist movements, Gamergate and the TERF movement, which has now rebranded itself as the Gender Critical movement. With the advent of Gamergate, testosterone went from an abstract master molecule in sports to a mainstream conversation. Pickup artists, conspiracy theorists, and sports personalities began linking sexual desirability to the hormone, with many of them making wild claims about its seemingly supernatural abilities. This led a sizable portion of cis men to build their entire identity around hormones. Random people were obsessively getting tested just so that they could compare their T levels on forums, leading to the creation of a market consisting of products that promise to increase a person's T levels and thus their status. This is also why many of the insults created by cis men around the mid-2010s, their cries of "better soy boy cuck," can be linked back to testosterone in some way. This also meant that, when new policies regarding the hormones in women's sports came into question, every incel on the internet suddenly felt like an expert. We see a similar bioessentialism in the transphobic rhetoric that followed the trans tipping point in 2014. As many trans folk, specifically trans women such as Laverne Cox, began to enter the public's eye, that brought with it questions about our place in society. This is when anti-trans bigots began arguing that trans women were an existential threat to both cis women and children. Their justification? Well, all trans women were far stronger than cis women thanks to testosterone, which, according to them, also makes trans women all child-raping monsters. Naturally, this standard was never applied to cis men, showing it to be nothing more than your garden variety transmisogyny, but the narrative was there. There was a key cultural shift that pulled the mysticism surrounding testosterone out of the hands of experts and into mainstream discourse, both online and offline. And it's that toxicity that the WA would deliberately tap into, effectively weaponizing the public's ignorance to justify its discriminatory policies against both trans and intersex women. That is why these struggles are interconnected. That is why you can't really talk about one without the other. Time for a little heart-to-heart as a writer, presenter, and editor. The reason I picked transphobia for the title of the video as opposed to interphobia is the same reason I picked transphobia over the more accurate term transmisia. More people know of and care about transphobia as a word and topic, so I'm using that word and the attached discourse to, hopefully, attract and educate as many people as possible. But, as expressed in the first video, trans people, intersex people, lesbians, and women of colour are all in this struggle together. We see this in the case of Santhi Soundarajan, a dark-skinned Indian athlete. Santhi was born in the southern state of Tamil in 1981 and grew up in abject poverty, suffering malnutrition from an early age. Things got so bad that her parents moved to another town in order to earn a whopping $4 a week, money which they sent back to Santhi, who looked after her siblings with the help of her grandfather. Her grandfather who, as fate would have it, was a former runner. In fact, Santhi's grandfather began to encourage the young girl to follow her own passion for running, training her on an open stretch of dirt in front of their house when she turned 13, even putting aside what little money he could to buy Santhi her very first pair of shoes. Soon enough, Santhi began to compete at inter-school races, winning herself no less than 14 awards, before being noticed by a nearby high school who subsequently recruited her, paying for her tuition as she continued to pursue running. It was a life-changing opportunity for Santhi, with her noting that it was the first time she had ever eaten 3 meals in a single day. Santhi continued to run, working her way up the sporting ladder until she went on to compete at the Asian Games in Doha in 2006, winning silver in the women's 800 meter. That's when she was accused of cheating and was subjected to invasive sex testing, which found her to have hyperandrogenism and thus designated her as intersex. The Olympic Council of Asia not only stripped Santhi of her medals, but officials told the press her results before informing her, not even giving her a chance to brace herself. And the response didn't get better from there. Outside of an award she received from the Tamil Chief Minister for her efforts at the Doha Games, of which every rupee was spent on tuition for the students she now coached, Santhi was on her own, with many viewing her as a national shame. Even the people of her home village treated her like an outsider. As Santhi would later tell the press, quote, "Everyone looked down on me. Everyone was looking at me in this new way. Is she a man? Is she a transvestite? It's very hurtful. It ruined my life and my family's life." End quote. The shame Santhi was forced to suffer became so unbearable that, in 2007, she tried to take her own life by ingesting poison. She was thankfully discovered, vomiting uncontrollably, by a friend who managed to get her to a hospital in time to save her life. But the scientific misogyny, as well as the extended intermisia and transmisia behind sex testing, had effectively ended this woman's professional sporting career. While she'd ultimately return to sports as a coach for others, she'd be forced to fight an uphill battle to even be recognized due to who she was. Her struggle, every adversity she had fought and overcome as a child growing up in abject poverty, was stripped away, with her perseverance being attributed to her being intersex. Though she wouldn't be the last, with another high-profile case being that of Indian lesbian sprinter Dutee Chand in 2014. Following her success in winning 2 gold medals at the Asian Junior Athletics Championships, the Athletic Federation of India, an associate of World Athletics, performed a hormonal sex test without Chand's knowledge. When the results came back positive for hyperandrogenism, Dutee was banned from the 2014 World Junior Championship in Oregon, the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, and the Asian Games in Korea, all in accordance with regulations imposed by the WA and IOC. It was then that Dutee was approached by the regulating bodies, with them telling her that she would only be allowed to compete if she underwent surgery, yet she refused, stating the following, quote, "They said that I could return to the track provided I went for surgery or else I would not be allowed to run again. I have no problems, but I was being advised to take medicines or undergo surgery. But when I have no health issues and my running is also not affected, why should I choose any of these options? So I decided to challenge the rules." End quote. And challenge them she did, appealing at the Court of Arbitration for Sport, who found that the WA had failed to provide sufficient evidence to justify their claims, stating that, quote, "In the absence of such evidence, the panel was unable to conclude that hyperandrogenic female athletes may enjoy such a significant performance advantage that it is necessary to exclude them from competing in the female category." End quote. As a result of the ruling, the CAS suspended the WA's regulations as of July 2015, giving them 2 years to present evidence of their claims, which would lead to the creation of their 2018 policy on intersex athletes. So you might be thinking, okay, the IOC and WA lacked evidence to support their positions throughout most of their history, but surely they have some now, right? Otherwise they wouldn't have been allowed to introduce new policies in 2018. And that is indeed the narrative that the WA likes to spin about their position. And to help them do this, the WA fell back on a 2017 paper published by none other than Dr. Berman in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, titled "Serum Androgen Levels and Their Relationship to Performance in Track and Field, Mass Spectrometry Results from 2,127 Observations in Male and Female Elite Athletes," what I'll be referring to as Study 1. On the surface, Study 1 does seem to suggest that high levels of testosterone correlate with athletic prowess in 5 out of 21 separate sporting events. However, Study 1 was so deeply flawed, methodologically, that it led to independent researchers demanding its immediate retraction. The WA didn't want to do that though, as it'd mean they'd have literally nothing to back up their new discriminatory policies. Instead, they had Dr. Berman publish a second corrected paper the following year, titled "Serum Androgen Levels Are Positively Correlated with Athletic Performance and Competition Results in Elite Female Athletes, what I'll call Study 2. The results Study 2 arrived at were completely different to those seen in Study 1 and called into question the title. For a start, athletes with lower testosterone were found to perform better in 3 out of 11 running events, and the strongest correlation across all events was a negative association between testosterone and athletic performance. That's to say, low testosterone athletes in events favoring low testosterone saw a 5.4% performance increase, whilst high testosterone athletes in events favoring high testosterone saw a meager 2.9% increase. So for Dr. Berman to title his paper "Serum Androgen Levels Are Positively Correlated with Athletic Performance" is certainly a choice, it's just not an honest one. It also means that if the WA and those pretending to care about fairness in sports were at all consistent with their claims, said evidence would force them to argue that women with lower levels of testosterone should be excluded from such events or even forced to undergo HRT to level the playing field. Of course, they'll never say that, as it was never about fairness, it was always about punishing women perceived as being too masculine. And yet, in spite of the changes, an independent report still found deep methodological issues with both papers, concluding that, quote, "The results of Study 1 are clearly unreliable, and those of Study 2 are of unknown validity. Further, without access to the medical data and all linked performances used in Study 1, it is impossible to know how or why certain athletes/results were removed and others not. What is unequivocal is that Study 1 used unreliable data, and thus its results are also unreliable. Different data and methods were used in Study 2, leading to significantly different results based on the almost certain use of flawed data, leading consequently to unreliable results. The bottom line is that the use of flawed data makes it impossible to know what, if any, relationship exists between the variables of Study 1 and Study 2, or to verify the reported results." End quote. Fact is, as of 2024, there is no scientific consensus that higher levels of innate testosterone correlate with an increase in athletic prowess, with some studies showing the complete opposite. One study even found that 25% of elite male athletes in 12 out of 15 sports had innate testosterone levels below what World Athletics considered the lower limit for men. And before people claim that this was only true of sports that put less emphasis on either strength or endurance, said sports included powerlifting, running, ice hockey, and rowing, both explosive and endurance sports, meaning that even the idea that testosterone gives peak performance in certain types of sport is a notion lacking any and all evidence. But that's just how things work. That's biology. That's biological fact. No, we don't need proof of what we're saying. It's just common sense. Wait, why does that sound so familiar? Right, because this is the exact same standard of evidence used by those utilizing scientific misogyny to argue that sports harmed women's reproductive organs and that the presence of an SRY gene would expose male imposters in women's sports, only for the IOC to flag 8 cis women with a false positive at the 1996 Atlanta Olympics. Just like these cases, there is no justification to uphold the WA's entirely arbitrary restrictions. Nothing outside of a desire to inflict as much pain and suffering upon women athletes as possible. Which brings us to our next high-profile case, that of Black South African lesbian Caster Semenya. Following the 2009 World Championships, people began speculating about Caster's sex, leading the WA to force her to undergo invasive medical exams, including nude photography. Speaking of her experience, Caster stated that, quote, I have been subjected to unwarranted and invasive scrutiny of the most intimate and private details of my being, which has infringed on not only my rights as an athlete, but also my fundamental and human rights, including my rights to dignity and privacy." End quote. Just like Santhi and Dutee, Castor was found to have hyperandrogenism. In order to have a chance at being allowed to compete, Castor would have to take medications to suppress said testosterone, medications that resulted in her falling violently ill. As Castor expressed at a later date, quote, "The WA used me in the past as a human guinea pig to experiment with how the medication they required me to take would affect my testosterone levels." End quote. Much like Dutee, Castor Semenya would continue to dispute the invasive and discriminatory policy, and whilst there was a temporary respite between 2015 and 2018, the new and completely unscientific policies for hyperandrogenism introduced in 2018 would be applied to the categories in which Castor competed in, forcing her to once again take up the fight. Her case garnered so much international attention that, in March of 2019, the United Nations Human Rights Council officially voted to condemn the actions of both the IOC and WA, stating that, quote, "The eligibility regulations for the female classification published by the International Association of Athletics Federations that came into effect on 1st November 2018 are not compatible with international human rights norms and standards, including the rights of women with differences of sex development." End quote. Whilst also listing the individual rights which are violated by such policies, namely 1. The right to equality and non-discrimination, 2. The right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, 3. The right to sexual and reproductive health, 4. The right to work and to the enjoyment of just and favourable conditions of work, 5. The right to privacy, 6. The right to freedom from torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment and harmful practices, and 7. The right to dignity, bodily integrity and bodily autonomy of the person. Yet, far from removing the restrictions targeting intersex and trans athletes, the WA would go on to introduce even stricter ones in March of 2023. This came as Castor attempted to appeal the 2018 regulations, with her appeal having been rejected by the Swiss Federal Tribunal in September of 2020. However, in July 2023, the European Convention on Human Rights ruled that such policies were discriminatory and thus violated Castor Semenya's human rights, meaning that the Swiss Federal Tribunal had failed in its duties and that she could challenge their initial ruling. Sadly, the ECHR doesn't have the power to overturn the WA's discriminatory policies, yet their ruling will allow Castor Semenya to continue challenging them. Yet, for as much international attention as Castor Semenya's case garnered, there were many more women who we failed to give such attention, bringing us to Annet, Negesa and Lara. Though, before we discuss their cases, I'd just like to give an additional disclaimer. The statements made throughout our videos are the opinions of myself, the host, based on the evidence I have available to me. They are not and should not be taken as unquestionable fact, which is why we reference everything, because we're fallible. Thus we try to give you, the viewer, the ability to check all evidence yourself in order to make up your own mind, which is what the reference numbers in the top left corner are for, being numbers that match up with the reference list found in the transcript linked down below. As such, we encourage all viewers to do their own research to reach an informed conclusion about the topic. Starting with Annet Negesa, she was told that she wouldn't be allowed to compete in the 2012 London Olympics after a 2011 hormone test revealed her to have hyperandrogenism. In hopes of getting the ban lifted, Annet travelled to France to undergo more tests carried out by the WA, being in contact with a Dr. Stefan Bermon via email. Said test revealed that Annet had internal testes, which is when a male doctor, who Annet assumed was Dr. Bermon, pressured her into undergoing a gonadectomy in 2012, reportedly hiding key details from her. As Annet later explained to ARD, a German broadcaster, quote, They told me it was kind of an injection, that they were pulling out my testosterone. But that's not what they did. When I woke up in the morning, I had wounds." End quote. Annet attempted to return to sports the following year, only to fail in regaining her former strength. Now some, including the WA, have presented this as evidence that shows the power of testosterone and just what a big difference internal testes play. The truth, meanwhile, is much, much darker. For you see, on top of failing to regain her strength, Annet became so ill at one point that she thought she would die. As she told the media, quote, "Because I saw my life was going, I started to go back to the village. As I said, if it is to die, let me die from home." End quote. That is not a normal reaction to a gonadectomy. Trans people who undergo said procedure do not suddenly wake up feeling like they are dying. There was clearly more to this case. Annet would thankfully get somewhat better with time, but was forced to leave her home country due to the persecution she now faced thanks to being outed as intersex, taking asylum in Germany. It would take her 7 years after her initial barring to find the strength to open up about what the WA had done to her, going public in 2019. Annet claimed that the WA, specifically Dr. Berman, had not only misled her as to what a gonadectomy was, but had, in fact, denied her HRT following the procedure. This meant her body no longer contained any sex hormone, which is essential for a number of bodily functions, including tissue maintenance. That's why postmenopausal people often suffer osteoporosis, the weakening of bone tissue. Except, that's just a reduction of sex hormone, Annet's were practically non-existent, making her condition far more severe. Now, I'm legally obliged to mention that the WA, of which Dr. Berman is now the head medical and science officer, asserts in no uncertain terms that, quote, "The WA strongly denies any suggestion that the WA or Dr. Stefan Berman was involved in her treatment or recommended any course of treatment to her." End quote. It's on this basis that they have threatened Annet with legal action for what they assert is defamation. That noted, this is a defense I find particularly interesting considering Dr. Berman's earlier presentation of himself as the, quote, "go-to person for all matters relating to and arising under the hyperandrogenism regulations," end quote, stating very publicly that he was, quote unquote, actively involved in every single hyperandrogenism case the WA had dealt with following the introduction of its 2011 regulations regarding said trait. The medical report for Annet's gonadectomy notes that she began treatment in June of 2012 at the recommendation of the WA, still the IAAF at the time. Ultimately, Annet did retract her claim that the doctor she met face to face was Dr. Berman. After all, it was 7 years ago, and she never actually got the doctor's name. She had been in contact with Dr. Berman throughout the process, leading her to naturally assume that the doctor she saw at the WA office was him. That noted, official medical reports from the hospital where Annet had her surgery not only lay out the facts that Annet was referred to them by the WA, they also go on to state the following, quote, "We have restrained from starting her on estrogen therapy, awaiting further discussions between Dr. Berman and Redacted on the way forward for her." End quote. Emphasis added by me, a fact that Dr. Berman and the WA have yet to explain. And before someone suggests that this was a mistake with the hospital, it seems like Annet wasn't alone. A second anonymous athlete from an entirely different country, known simply as Lara, came forward about the fact that she'd received the same treatment as Annet and now suffers osteoporosis due to being denied HRT. The damage, both physically and mentally, was so severe that Lara often contemplated suicide. stating that she wished she had died on the operating table. With that considered, we had to ask ourselves, what are the chances that two women from completely different countries operated on in completely different hospitals both suffered the exact same malpractice? This wouldn't even be the first time the WA has been caught out lying, if they are indeed doing so here. In 2015, when the athletics watchdog, the Sports Integrity Initiative, or SII, reported on the facts that the WA had pushed intersex athletes into undergoing gonadectomies in order to be able to compete, the WA denied any such thing. However, the SII noted that a preliminary paper published in 2013, titled Molecular Diagnoses of 5 Reductase Deficiency in 4 Elite Young Female Athletes Through Hormonal Screening and Hyperandrogenism, which Dr. Berman was an author of, seems to prove otherwise. The journal article states, and I do quote, "Although leaving male gonads in patients with this condition carries no health risk, each athlete was informed that gonadectomy would most likely decrease their performance level, but allow them to continue elite sport in the female category," end quote, emphasis added by me. In fact, Annet and Lara are believed by some, including Annet herself, to have been 2 of the 4 athletes in said paper, all of whom came from, quote, rural or mountainous regions of developing countries, end quote, and had been told that they needed to undergo a gonadectomy in order to compete in the 2012 London Olympics. Indeed, the timelines do match up, and, let's be honest, it wouldn't be the first time a bunch of Europeans experimented on black Africans, only to deny it. The paper itself sought to prove that gonadectomies significantly reduced athletic prowess, thus demonstrating an unfair advantage on behalf of those with hyperandrogenism. The methodological issue of which is the fact that some, if not all, of the participants seem to have been denied vital aftercare, specifically HRT. That means the researchers weren't recording the results of the gonadectomy and subsequent reduction in testosterone, they were recording the results of physical and psychological trauma brought about by a complete deprivation of an essential hormone. And as if that isn't enough, SII reported that, quote, "In addition, a source has alleged that the performance times of only 3 of the 4 athletes were used because 1, remarkably, showed an improvement in performance post-surgery. It is also understood that the WA cherry-picked the performance times from other athletes that backed its proposition." End quote. This to me reads as the 4th athlete's doctor going over the WA to prescribe HRT, screwing with their results, but that is just speculation. With all that evidence laid out, is it just me, or is it beginning to look like Dr. Berman not only blocked Annet and Lara's aftercare as a means to get the results the WA were after, but excluded any data that contradicted their hypothesis? Something that needs to be kept in mind here, since I don't want to leave you with the impression that every terrible thing at the WA is the fault of Dr. Berman, is the fact that his promotion at the WA seems to coincide with his unwavering support of their attempts to police and exclude intersex athletes. This isn't a problem man, this is an ethically bankrupt system operating exactly as intended, contrary to what it advertises itself as being. Now, again, I'm legally required to state that it is possible that this is all a really ugly coincidence. Yet I find that hard to believe, especially in light of the fact that Dr. Berman was explicitly named in Annet's medical records. With that noted, these cases are the main reason I felt the need to make this video. This is absolutely horrific, and not enough people are talking about it. In my eyes, those willingly associating with the WA and supporting its anti-intersex, anti-trans policies are signing off on colonial human experimentation. This should be the main takeaway from this video, and please, if you're thinking of commenting on the topic, do so. The more people who talk about this, the less likely it'll be forgotten. Yet, returning to the WA, I personally think that, based on the evidence available and how the WA responded by trying to silence Annet, that said institution is well and truly beyond saving. I feel that it needs to be abolished in its entirety, replaced with a more human rights-centric organisation. I also believe that those directly involved, such as Dr. Berman, Dr. Berman's overhead, and whoever is responsible for promoting Dr. Berman to his current position, should be investigated by both a medical tribunal and legal court to get to the bottom of what happened and just how much each individual knew. I personally believe that, if the evidence uncovered by such an investigation matches what we currently have available to us, said people should be prosecuted for their crimes because this is such an extreme level of violence that it can't go unopposed. The people responsible not only need to be sued into oblivion with the money going to their victims, but they also need to be stripped of any licensing they have to ensure that they never even think about practicing again. This case is particularly frustrating as I'm an abolitionist, meaning I don't believe prison is an effective or ethical form of punishment, but if there was an argument to be made for life in prison, it would be an instance such as this. I'm not joking. That's the severity of what Dr. Berman and the WA has been accused of. If true, Dr. Berman acted in a premeditated manner, fully aware of the long-term consequences of hormone deprivation. Even worse, he is ultimately a doctor trained in ethics. He was cognizant, more than most in fact, of why his actions were wrong, yet he chose to ignore that, making said crimes even worse than if he'd been acting out of simple negligence. Though, to be clear, I am not a lawyer, that is merely my opinion as a layman, based on the evidence I have available to me. Sadly, this is as far as I can go. In my original 2021 version of the script for this series, which was one video by the way, I followed up the case studies by discussing recent developments, both with the IOC and WA. And I remember being rather hopeful at the time, with the IOC's Medical and Science Director, Dr. Richard Budgett, coming forward and admitting that the rules and regulations put in place to limit testosterone in women were based on bad science and were thus unfit for purpose. This was then followed up by an IOC framework for fairness, inclusion and non-discrimination, among which were the claims of no presumption of advantage and an evidence-based approach, all of which led me to, rather optimistically, see this as the beginning of things getting better. Then, the next 3 years happened. Trans and intersex women were not only barred from numerous sporting institutions and events, but some of the controversies were fucking absurd, including trans participation in darts and chess. Bloody chess. Not even an athletic sport, all because of just how toxic and irrational the discussion has become. Correction has been made. Part of me wanted to sort through all this to try and figure out where we're going, but the more I tried, the more it began to physically hurt. I began to feel like my skull was cracking open. I felt like Ahab chasing the whale, feeling like it would always be one step ahead of me, one study away from finally being caught. There's just one major problem with that analogy. Ahab doesn't catch the whale. He is instead pulled down to a watery grave in the process, a victim of his own obsession. I am putting down the harpoon. This is as far as I can go. It's time to cut the line and head home, to let others make use of the work I have already done. Because there's so much important stuff here, stuff I don't see anyone else talking about, and not all of it horror. Again, thinking back to Leon and Pierre, to Witold and Zenek, there is good stuff here, stuff to be proud of and look back upon fondly. Stuff I felt like it was my duty to share, even if I couldn't end this video or the series how I had originally intended to. Though there is one last thing I like to do before ending this video, and that's address a hidden fallacy which has been present throughout much of the discussion, namely the idea that proving trans women have, on average, an advantage over cis women is the same as proving that trans women have an unfair advantage and should thus be excluded from sports. It isn't. For a start, professional sports isn't about averages. Olympic-level athletes are not representative of your average person. They have gone through an active process of selection which has picked out the best of the best in whatever category they belong to. The fastest runner, the strongest powerlifter, the most agile gymnast. Professional-level sports will always pick the outliers, those who by very definition are above and thus separate to the average, making discussions based around said advantage completely erroneous. A great example of this is Margot Didek, a 7' 2" basketball player who sadly passed away whilst giving birth. If your argument is that trans women should be banned from sports for being, on average, a couple inches taller than your average cis woman, that is a discriminatory argument since it would, if applied equally, also lead to the disqualification of numerous cis women, such as Margot Didek, who wasn't 1 or 2 inches above the average, but a whole 1 foot 10 inches. It's not the averages we should be looking at, but the full range of female bodies and abilities, including those of intersex women. On this basis, I would offer the rule that any argument for the removal of trans athletes that would, if applied equally, result in the exclusion of any cis woman, yet isn't, can and should be dismissed out of hand as entirely discriminatory. Yet, returning to the two statements, an advantage doesn't necessitate an unfair advantage, a fact seen throughout sport. On top of the previous Margot Didek example, the classic one is that of Michael Phelps, a US swimmer who, due to a combination of genetic mutations, has an abnormally large wingspan, double-jointed ankles, and the ability to metabolize in a way that only produces around half the lactic acid of his competitors, meaning he can recover quicker and train harder than his peers. Yet, in spite of these very clear and distinct advantages, he isn't accused of being unfair or stripped of his titles and banned from sports. Rather, Michael is presented as a sporting hero, an icon, someone upheld and celebrated explicitly because of his advantages. So, if we're being consistent and not discriminatory, an advantage alone is not enough to justify the exclusion of women. Do trans women have an advantage is only the first question, with is said advantage unfair being just as important. So when people take the currently unsubstantiated claim that trans women have an advantage over cis women as automatic justification for excluding them, I would argue that, just like the over-reliance on averages, such demand is entirely discriminatory. It is quite literally holding a historically marginalized group to a harsher standard than everyone else. Therefore, it is said standard, not trans participation, that is intrinsically unfair. Demonstrating that trans and intersex women have an advantage only proves that there's ground for a conversation, and that is it. It does not act as grounds to strip trans people, or indeed any group, of numerous human rights. Trans women, just like intersex women, are women, and thus have as much claim to women's sports as any other woman. And that's it. That's the end. If you appreciate what we do here and want to help out, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make our work possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Gerrit Van Voorst, Goss Leiter, Marble Wings, Sosh Daniels, Flynn, Higgins the Seagull, and Ocean on a Teaspoon. And for myself, Adita and Levi, take care now.